If you haven't seen the first part of the 1500MX installation video, it covers the unboxing, removal from the pallet, and the enclosure and operator console installation. If you want to view that, follow the link up above or in the description. Before you continue to the rest of this installation, make sure you read all the warnings and cautions in the operator manual, which you can get from the support dropdown on the Tormach website, and by clicking on the 1500MX and then the Documents tab. The first section of part 2 of this video is turning on the 1500MX. Find the electrical cord and plug it into the single-phase 230 volt 50 to 60 Hz dedicated outlet. The 1500MX has a recommended circuit amperage of 30 amps at the breaker. You must contact a certified electrician if you plan to hardwire the 1500MX. If the electrical safety tag is still on your machine, cut that off now. It was removed earlier in the first part. Make sure the path pilot key is inserted, then press the power button. This key is needed to switch between run and setup mode. Then you can turn the main disconnect switch to on. Path pilot will start up. Path pilot may ask to set up a network device. You can choose to set that up or skip. Once Path pilot starts, rotate the emergency stop button a quarter turn to release it. Then press the blue reset button to enable the machine. The 1500MX axes drives will now be powered on. On the status tab, check if the machine OK light changes from yellow to green. The shipping block will still be under the spindle head. To raise it, first close the door. Press the on-screen reset button. Then either use the keyboard page up key or the pendant to raise the spindle up in Z to release the shipping block. Remove the block off the table. Now is a good time to remove the protective cover off of the table. Setting up the coolant tank and pump. Start by removing the lid from the crate, then remove all the boxes, followed by the 2 chip baskets. Discard the packing material. With the wireless drill and a Phillips bit, remove the screws securing the wood clamps holding the coolant tank down. There are 4 in total, but you only need to remove 2. Slide the tank from under 2 of the clamps. Then lift the tank up off the pallet with the help of an assistant. You can then return the chip pans back to the tank and slide it behind the 1500MX. Lock the wheels in place. Before installing the coolant equipment, you need to understand the layout of the coolant tank. There are 2 baskets that sit under the coolant chutes. Both are removable for cleanup. Then there are 2 locations for the equipment for the flood and washdown system. The pump and filter for the flood go into the left side of the tank as you are standing behind it. The pump and filter for the washdown go into the location to the right of that. Identify the knockout to the left as you stand behind the tank. Use a rubber mallet to pop out the knockout. Remove the coolant pump from its packaging. Then find the check valve elbow and wrap Teflon tape around the threads of the left elbow in a clockwise direction. Thread it onto the coolant pump and turn it so that it's secure and points upright. If the elbow isn't tight and upright, remove the Teflon tape and wrap an extra layer around the check valve until it's mounted correctly, but no more than 3 layers. Slide the pump into its location with the check valve pointing to the left, as shown here. Use an 8mm hex wrench to secure the pump with 4 M10 socket head cap screws. Find the coolant filter, and to make it easier to install, flip it upside down from the bracket and secure the bracket with a 3mm wrench and 4 M5 flanged button head screws. Remove the wire tie from the pump's electrical cable. Feed it to the electrical cabinet and secure it to the flood coolant power input. Find the 1-foot-long hose with a 1-inch OD. Secure it to the inlet of the coolant filter and slide on the hose clamp. Slide the hose clamp over the fitting with a pair of pliers. Slide the second hose clamp onto the other end of the hose. If the hose appears as though it would crimp, Determine a better length and cut off the excess. And secure that end of the hose onto the outlet of the coolant pump. Use pliers to slide the clamp spring over the outlet fitting. Resecure the hose and clamp it down. Screw the 2 coolant manifold standoffs onto the rear of the machine casting, just above the pass-through cover. Tighten with a 13mm wrench until snug. Attach the coolant manifold with the aluminum fitting pointing to the left and secure with 2 M6x10 flanged button head screws using a 4mm hex wrench. Install the Y-axis washdown. Behind the table, remove the screws securing the cover plate off of the Y-axis rear way cover with a 2.5mm hex wrench. Throw out the cover plate and screws. Find the Y-axis washdown block. You will need to disassemble this by removing the nuts with a 2.5mm hex wrench. But there are O-rings inside that need to be kept in place. So rip off a couple pieces of masking tape and tape the washdown block together so that the screws can be removed. Align the Y-axis washdown block onto the Y-axis rear way cover and secure with the screws you just removed. Remove the masking tape. At the rear of the mill, remove the 5 screws securing the rear access panel and set the screws aside. Take the panel to a secure surface and have someone hold it down while you knock out the upper left knockout with a hammer and punch. Find the 20-inch long OD hose and install the hose to the 1/2-inch barbed hose fitting on the back of the washdown block with 1 hose clamp and a pair of pliers. Install the loose end of the hose onto the 1/2-inch barbed elbow fitting on the coolant manifold with a hose clamp and a pair of pliers. And find the access panel around the hoses. Then route the air lines into the bottom knockout and the 5/8-inch long hose through the top knockout. Then reinstall the access panel with the 5 M6 screws that you set aside earlier. Install the flood coolant ring. To remove the spindle cover, remove the 9 M6 flange button head cap screws with the 4mm hex wrench. Set the screws aside. You will need to climb a ladder to get to the top screws. Remove the 3 screws on the underside last. Remove the cover and set it aside. Find the swiveling coolant nozzles and the coolant ring that are included in the kit. Install each nozzle into the coolant ring with a 17mm wrench. Tighten the nozzles until they're pointed towards the center of the ring. The first few 1500 MX coolant rings will have plugs that go into these locations. Find the 2 coolant ring mounts. Loosely secure 1 coolant ring mount around the upward bend of the coolant ring, with the larger piece around the top with the flat end facing in. Then place this into the notch of the spindle mount on the right side of the coolant ring. And loosely snug the coolant ring mount on the right side of the spindle with a 4mm hex wrench. On the other side, slide the larger portion of the mount over the open end. Then bring in the screw inserted into the small portion and secure to the open hole. Find the 12-foot by 1-inch OD hose and 2 hose clamps. We found it easier to feed the hose through the top of the energy chain down to the coolant manifold block. But to do this, you need to remove several of the energy chain covers at the corners with a flat blade screwdriver. It may be helpful to have the Z-axis raised to its maximum height. Once the hose is through the bottom, take the loose end and run it up through the pass-through space on the rear right top of the spindle cowling. Slide a hose clamp onto the end with pliers and slide the hose onto the barb hose fitting on top of the coolant ring. Secure with the hose clamp. Pull out the excess hose out of the back. If you have the spindle all the way up in Z and you have too much excess hose hanging out of the back, cut off that excess and then mount it onto the coolant manifold. But you have to make sure it's raised completely in Z and you have just a little bit of excess for any give. Place the spindle cover onto a solid surface and use a punch to remove the knockout. Bring the spindle down in Z. Then reinstall the spindle cover with the screws you removed earlier. If you are also installing the minimum quantity lubrication system, then you will reinstall this panel later, so keep it aside. Double check that the valve isn't impeded by the spindle cover by opening and closing it a few times. If you are also installing the minimum quantity lubrication system, then you will want to reinstall this panel later. In addition, you will want to keep the energy chain covers off. Remove the plastic grommet on the top right panel. The hose nozzle bracket comes with the M6 button head cap screw. Remove that with a 4mm hex wrench. Place it underneath and line up the grommet and screw holes. While holding it with the finger from above, secure it in place with the screw. Find the bulkhead fitting and remove the locking nut and one of the 2 rubber washers. Place it into the hole, pointing at the spindle at a 45-degree angle. From underneath, reinstall the washer and locking nut. Secure with a 30mm or 1 by 1/8 inch socket wrench. Find the hose bib and wrap thread sealant tape to the inlet side. Thread this side into the bulkhead fitting. We use the end of a hex wrench into the pipe to keep it from spinning, while someone tightens it up from up top with a 32mm wrench. Make sure the shutoff valve is facing to the back of the mill so that the shutoff can be turned off easily. Find the hose and manual sprayer. Make sure the rubber seal is installed in the fitting and then secure it to the hose bib. Hang the manual sprayer onto the bracket. Find the 7-foot by 5/8 inch OD hose. Route this hose from the back and through the channel running down the middle of the top panel. Connect this end to the elbow fitting with a pair of pliers and the hose clamp. Connect one end to the straight 1/2 inch barb hose fitting on the side of the coolant manifold with a pair of pliers and a hose clamp. Make coolant connections. Find the 4-foot by 1 inch OD hose. Connect one end to the barb fitting on the bottom of the coolant manifold with a pair of pliers and one hose clamp. Connect the loose end of the hose to the barb fitting on the outlet of the coolant filter with a pair of pliers and one hose clamp. Plug the power cable from the flood coolant pump into the flood coolant power outlet on the side of the electrical cabinet. After setting up the flood coolant kit, add water and coolant to the tank at the appropriate mixture. Then test the enclosure for coolant leaks. If you find any, wipe off the coolant, clean with denatured alcohol, then wipe it dry completely. Seal this with Sikaflex. If you don't get all the coolant off of the enclosure, the Sikaflex won't seal properly. Install the washdown pump. The 1/2 horsepower washdown coolant pump is installed in the middle mounting plate. Put it in the tank with the pump's outlet pointing to the left. Secure the pump onto the tank with 4 M8 by 1 1/4 20 socket head cap screws and a 6mm hex wrench. Install the coolant hoses and fittings. Attach the 2 standoffs on the 2 locations on the lower back of the casting. Secure with a 13mm wrench. Find the 3 hoses, 1 T-fitting, and the 3 hose clamps. Install the hoses and the hose clamps onto the T-fittings with pliers. To help get the hoses onto the fittings, you can add a thin bead of dish soap onto each end. Once all the hoses are on securely, use the pliers to fasten the hose clamps. Slide the 2 loop clamps onto the right and left hoses. Then use the M6 by 1 by 10 flange button head cap screws to secure the loop clamps and the T-fitting brackets to the 2 standoffs with the 4mm hex wrench. Install the washdown coolant filter. Find the washdown coolant filter included with this kit. It's installed next to the washdown coolant pump on the coolant tank. We found it easier to angle the filter tank forward for easier access to the bracket. Secure with 4 M5 by 10 flange button head cap screws and a 3mm hex wrench. Find the 1 foot long by 1 inch OD hose included with this kit. Slide on the hose clamps, then install the hose between the barb fittings on the outlet of the coolant pump. Slide a hose clamp onto the other side and install in the inlet of the coolant filter and slide on the hose clamp. Connect the top hose from the T-fitting to the barb fitting on the coolant pump with pliers and a hose clamp. Install the washdown bars. Open the windows on both sides of the enclosure. Remove the 2 rubber plugs from both back panels. Find one of the washdown bars, 3 loop clamps, 1 pipe grommet, and 3 M6 screws. Install the loop clamps onto the washdown bar. Put one of the pipe grommets into the hole in the back panel. Slide the barb fitting end of the washdown bar through the grommet in the back panel. Loosely fasten each of the loop clamps to the side of the chip pan with 3 M6 screws and a 4mm hex wrench. Turn the washdown bar so that the nozzles are pointing down toward the chip pan. Once the bar is correctly aligned, tighten all of the loop clamps. Repeat these steps for the washdown bar on the opposite side of the enclosure. Slide on the hose clamp. Connect the loose end of each remaining hose on the T-fitting to the barb fitting on either side of the enclosure with pliers and a hose clamp. Plug the pump's power cable into the washdown coolant power outlet on the side of the electrical cabinet. Install the minimum quantity lubrication kit. To route the tubing from the spindle to the pump, you'll need to remove the tubing from the pump side and then reconnect it to the back of the machine. Unscrew the 3/8" push-to-connect fitting from the pump block with a wrench. Pull the outer 3/8" tube and push-to-connect fitting away from the pump block, exposing the 1/8" nylon capillary tube. Grasp this capillary tube with a pair of needle-nose pliers. Lever the pliers against the edge of the pump block to pull the capillary from the brass barb fitting in the pump. Remove the push-in fitting from the 3/8" tube and set it aside. In the pump, verify there are no remnants of the 1/8" capillary tube on the brass barb fitting. Route the tubing. Mount the nozzle behind the spindle head with the included hardware and the 3/16" hex wrench. If you haven't already done so, remove the spindle head cover. Remove the 9 M6 flanged button head cap screws on the right spindle cover with the 4mm hex wrench. Set the screws aside. Then remove the 3 screws on the bottom of the spindle head cover. Remove the cover and set it aside. Route the tubing from the nozzle up through the hole on the bottom left of the spindle head casting. Continue up to the top of the spindle housing and out through the top left hole. From the back of the machine, route the tubing through the energy chain. It will help to raise the Z-axis to its maximum height and to remove a few of the energy chain cover panels to more easily route the tubing through the energy chain. You can use a flathead screwdriver to do this. Once the hose is all the way through, resecure the energy chain covers. Route the tubing between the machine casting and the electrical cabinet. Mount the pump. Find the solenoid and pressure regulator assembly. Wrap thread seal tape around the threads of the brass fitting on the solenoid. Thread the brass fitting onto the pump. To reconnect the tubing to the pump, you'll need about 1/8" of the capillary tube exposed from the 3/8" tube. Carefully insert a hex wrench and lightly push the 1/8" capillary tube in. Then cut the 3/8" tube with a razor blade. Redo this process if you accidentally cut the 1/8" capillary tube. Reinstall the push-to-connect fitting that you set aside onto the 3/8" tube. Carefully install the 1/8" capillary tube onto the brass fitting on the pump with a pair of needle-nose pliers. You will need to carefully wiggle it onto the barb fitting until it's secure. If it isn't, it may result in system performance issues. Screw the push-to-connect fitting back into the pump block. Mount the pump with its magnetic base onto the machine column access panel. The magnet won't adhere to the casting itself. Route the solenoid wire into the bottom of the electrical cabinet. In the bottom left corner of the electrical cabinet, plug the solenoid wire into the XS36 MQL control connector. Pull the extra wire into the electrical cabinet. Coil it up and secure it with a cable tie. On the back, identify the air line that's connected to the machine's FRL. Cut off the wire tie, then, with it still connected to the FRL, measure out the other end to the inlet valve of the MQL solenoid. Cut off the excess, and then connect this end to the MQL solenoid push-to-connect fitting. Once the mist collector is installed, fill up the UNIS tank with Cool Lube and screw the cap back on. Once everything is installed onto the 1500 MX, go through the cables and hoses and clean up the bundles with cable ties. That's it for part 2 of the 1500 MX installation. As always, our manuals are easily downloaded from the website, and our technical and pre-sales teams are available for any of your questions. Thanks for watching.